The moment I need to tell you about happened at a Sunday lunch, in my mother-in-law's dining room, in the 37th week of my pregnancy, while I was sitting at a table that had never quite felt like mine despite the number of meals I had eaten at it over the preceding 4 years. Miriam had been talking about the baby for most of the afternoon. Not in the way of a grandmother-to-be who is happy about an arriving grandchild, not with the particular warmth that the occasion might reasonably have generated, but in the specific way that Miriam talked about most things that were primarily mine, with a quality of detachment that was dressed up convincingly as concern, the particular social fluency of a woman who has spent decades making unkindness look like care. She had made 3 comments before the one that mattered. I am noting this because I think the sequence matters, because the 3 comments that came before the 4th were the runway rather than the arrival, the careful preparation of a room's social temperature before the temperature was used for something specific. The first comment was about my diet, offered to my sister-in-law Caroline across the table with the casual confidence of someone sharing information rather than delivering judgment. Apparently I had been eating too much salt, Miriam had noticed at the previous gathering, and wasn't that difficult with the swelling. Wasn't that something worth addressing? The second comment was about my birth plan, which I had apparently mentioned to my husband Thomas at some point and which had made its way, through whatever channel these things travel between a husband and his mother, to Miriam's awareness, and about which she had what she called simply a few thoughts, delivered without invitation. The third comment was about my age. I was 34, which Miriam described as a perfectly fine age to be having a first child, and this perfectly fine was delivered in the specific register of someone using reasonable language to communicate unreasonable implications. That I sat through all 3 of these comments in the way I had learned to sit through Miriam's comments across 4 years of marriage to her son, which was to say with a surface composure that I had become skilled at maintaining and an interior that was considerably less composed, filing each comment in the mental ledger I had been keeping since the first month of our marriage when I had understood, with the specific clarity of someone whose optimism about a situation has just met evidence that challenges it, that Miriam and I were going to have a particular kind of relationship rather than the other kind. And then the 4th comment arrived during a natural pause in the table's conversation, one of those pauses that happen in group gatherings, when several threads of discussion have simultaneously concluded and no one has yet picked up a new one, a pause with a quality of brief attentiveness that meant more people were available to hear what came next than might otherwise have been. Miriam was speaking to Caroline, which was the configuration she often used for her most pointed observations, directing them at someone other than me while ensuring I could hear them clearly, a technique that allowed for later deniability since she had not, technically, said anything to my face. You know, Miriam said, in the conversational tone of someone sharing a mild, passing observation rather than something she had been building toward, with everything being so modern now, I always think it's wise for a couple to get everything, shall we say, confirmed before the baby actually arrives. Just to have clarity. It must be so reassuring, that certainty. She did not say my baby probably isn't Thomas's, she did not need to. She had said something that, in the context of that table and those relationships and the specific, carefully maintained history of 4 years of her opinions about me, said exactly that while being constructed in such a way that anyone who called it out could be told they were being sensitive, that she had merely been discussing modern medical options in a general way, that the specific interpretation was the listener's own projection rather than her intention. That it was, in the language of people who wound carefully and with plausible deniability, a masterpiece. That I did not move. I did not change my expression. I had learned this too, across 4 years, the specific discipline of not giving Miriam the visible reaction she was generating, because visible reaction was, in some fundamental sense, what the technique was designed to harvest. That I looked at Thomas. That he was sitting 2 seats away from me, which meant I could see his face clearly. Which meant I saw what I am about to describe without any possibility of having misread it. That he was smiling, not a polite smile, not the strained smile of a man managing a difficult social situation, not even the uncomfortable grimace of a man who has heard something he knows is wrong and doesn't know how to address it. He was smiling the specific smile of someone who finds something genuinely amusing, a smile with ease in it, with comfort, with no apparent awareness that what had just been said in that room was something that required any response other than the one he was currently giving it. He had heard every word. He had understood every word. And he was smiling that I had been married to Thomas for 4 years and 2 months at that Sunday lunch. I had known him for 6 years total, having met him at a conference where we were both working, falling into the kind of conversation that extended past every reasonable stopping point because stopping it felt like losing something. Spending the following 3 months in a long-distance relationship before geography was resolved and the relationship was formalized into the more permanent structure it had always seemed to be building toward. The first 2 years of marriage had been, in the terms I used to understand my own life, good. Thomas was genuinely funny, genuinely intelligent, capable of the specific kind of tenderness that is most legible not in grand gestures but in small, consistent, daily attentions that accumulate over time into a feeling of being genuinely seen. He cooked on weeknights without being asked. He remembered things I mentioned once without writing them down. He had, in the particular way of people who are built for partnership, a quality of presence in our shared life that felt full rather than partial. What he also had, and what I had understood from the beginning and had accepted as a fixed feature of the landscape rather than something requiring direct examination, was Miriam, not Miriam as a simple, manageable fact of a husband's family. Miriam as an active, ongoing dimension of our marriage, present in ways that went beyond the ordinary presence of a mother-in-law, present in the specific, total way of a woman who had organized her son's emotional life around herself for 37 years and had not, when he married, renegotiated that organization. Thomas was an only child. His father had died when Thomas was 11, a fact that had shaped him in ways he articulated clearly and ways he didn't articulate at all, and the shaping included a relationship with Miriam that had, in the years following his father's death, become the primary attachment of both their lives rather than simply the attachment of a mother and a child. They had, in the decades between his father's death and his marriage to me, been each other's primary person, and this arrangement had calcified, in the way that arrangements do when they are sustained long enough, into something that felt to both of them less like a choice and more like a natural fact that I had understood this, going in. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters for understanding everything that followed. I had not been naive about Miriam, had not expected her to be uncomplicated, had known from the early months of my relationship with Thomas that she was a woman of strong opinions and limited willingness to revise them, who considered her son's life her primary domain and any person who occupied a significant portion of it as something requiring management rather than welcome. What I had believed, and believed genuinely rather than naively, was that Thomas and I had reached an understanding about this. That we had talked, in the specific, careful way of two adults navigating a complicated situation, about how his relationship with Miriam would coexist with our marriage, about the ways in which I would be patient and she would be given time and that time would produce, gradually, something more comfortable than what we were starting with, what I had not understood, and what the smile at that Sunday lunch made suddenly, comprehensively clear, was that I had been negotiating and understanding with Thomas about his mother, while Thomas had been maintaining a separate, parallel understanding with his mother about me that I am going to tell you, because I think you deserve the full picture. What Miriam had been doing for 4 years, she had not been warming up slowly, the way I had optimistically framed her coldness as the natural pace of a guarded woman coming to accept a daughter-in-law she hadn't chosen. She had been, consistently and with considerable skill, conducting a sustained, low-level campaign against my standing in the family that I had repeatedly explained away as personality rather than intention, as generational rather than personal, as temporary rather than structural. The comments about my background, offered to relatives at gatherings I attended, positioned as observations about how different Thomas's world and mine were, how interesting that he had chosen so differently from what anyone might have expected. My background was perfectly ordinary, which made the fascination with it as a category of difference almost impressive in its invention. The comments about my career, delivered with the specific warmth of someone who found ambition in women theoretically admirable and practically inconvenient, particularly when that ambition competed with the time and attention she considered available for family obligations. The comments about our home, which was my home before Thomas moved into it, which Miriam referred to with a possessive consistency as Thomas's place, as though my decade of prior occupancy was a clerical detail rather than a foundational fact. Each of these, individually, could be absorbed and explained and moved past. The pattern of them, assembled, was something considerably more deliberate and considerably more damaging than any individual comment on its own. Thomas had been present for all of it, that he had, on several occasions, said things that functioned as mild pushback. "Mom, that's not really fair," or "I think you might be misreading that," gentle, cushioned interventions that stopped well short of actual consequence and that Miriam had absorbed and navigated around with the ease of a woman whose sons. Mild pushback had never, in 37 years, produced anything she couldn't manage. That I had thanked him for these interventions. I had told myself they were meaningful. I understood now, been mistaking the performance of advocacy for advocacy itself. The baby had been, for both of us, something we had wanted for longer than the pregnancy. We had been trying for 18 months before the positive test, 18 months of the specific, grinding emotional labor of wanting something that isn't happening. And when it finally happened, I had felt a joy so complete and so specific that it had, for a period, reorganized my understanding of the marriage around its best features rather than its most complicated ones. The pregnancy had not reorganized Miriam. That if anything, the pregnancy had intensified her, in the specific way that things intensify when the stakes they are affecting become higher. A grandchild was a new territory in the map of her son's life, new territory that required positioning, and Miriam positioned herself within the first month of the pregnancy announcement with the decisive efficiency of someone who had been planning for this specific development. She had opinions about everything. Where I should deliver. Who should be present in the room. What the nursery should look like. What the child should be named. These opinions arrived as suggestions, which is to say they arrived dressed in the costume of suggestions while carrying the weight of expectations. That I sat in that dining room on that Sunday in my 37th week, looking at my husband's smile, and I thought about all of this, the 4 years and the pattern and the mild pushbacks that had never produced consequences and the clear, cheerful, comfortable smile that he was currently wearing in response to his mother suggesting, in a room full of his family, that the child I was carrying probably wasn't his, and I understood something that I had been approaching for 4 years without quite arriving at. The smile was not a lapse. It was not an accident. It was not the smile of a man who had not understood what his mother said or who had misread the room or who was smiling at something else entirely. That it was the smile of a man who was, on some fundamental level, on his mother's side, not consciously, perhaps. Not with malice. But in the specific, automatic, unconsidered way of someone whose deepest loyalty had never, despite marriage and partnership and a child arriving in 3 weeks, fully relocated from where it had lived for 37 years. That I finished the meal. That I thanked Miriam for the food with the specific courtesy that the situation required and that I had always maintained regardless of the situation, because I was the kind of person who maintained courtesy as a discipline rather than a mood. That I got in the car with Thomas, who was relaxed and easy beside me in the passenger seat, and I drove home in the particular silence of two people who have not yet begun a conversation but are both aware that it is coming. When we got home, I went upstairs. I changed out of the clothes I had worn to the lunch. I sat on the edge of our bed in the specific quiet of our bedroom with the late afternoon light coming through the curtains, and I sat with everything I had been not quite examining for 4 years, and I let myself, finally, examine it, not with panic. Not with the explosive grief that the situation might reasonably have generated. With the particular, clear-eyed stillness of someone who has finally looked directly at something they were afraid to look at and discovered that they can bear looking at it, which was, in its own way, a form of relief. That I thought about the smile, and I decided that the smile required a response that I had not yet been willing to give. That I need to tell you about the pattern, because the Sunday lunch comment did not arrive in isolation. The way that the most damaging things rarely arrive in isolation, but are instead the culmination of a series of smaller, individually deniable moments that have been accumulating, quietly and with compound interest, for longer than you have been willing to fully account for. The pattern had begun, as patterns of this kind often begin, so early and so gently that the beginning itself was difficult to identify in retrospect. There was no single inaugural incident that I could point to and say, here is where it started. Here is the first stone in what became a wall. There was instead a gradual establishment of a particular dynamic, laid down in the first months of my relationship with Thomas with the specific care of someone who understands that foundations are more durable than anything built on top of them. The first Thanksgiving I attended at Miriam's house, 8 months into our relationship and still operating in the early optimism of someone who wants to make a good impression and believes that good impressions, sufficiently sustained, eventually produce good relationships, Miriam had set the table with 12 place settings. 12 people were attending. 11 place cards had been written in Miriam's precise handwriting and arranged at the seats she had assigned. One place, mine, had no card. This could have been an oversight. I had told myself it was an oversight. When I mentioned it to Thomas afterward, he had said, yes, probably an oversight. He was sure she hadn't meant anything by it, and I had accepted this because I was 8 months into a relationship I valued and because the alternative interpretation required me to believe something about his mother that I was not yet ready to believe. By the second Thanksgiving I understood that it had not been an oversight. There was no place card for me at the second Thanksgiving either. Nor at the Christmas that followed, nor at the Easter, nor at any of the gatherings across the subsequent years where Miriam set a table and placed name cards at each seat with her precise handwriting. I had a seat at every gathering. Miriam was not so crude as to leave me without a seat, but the seat was always unmarked, as though my presence at the table were a provisional arrangement that didn't quite warrant the permanence of written designation. That I had stopped expecting the place card sometime in the second year of my relationship, which was also around the time I stopped describing these gatherings to my friends using the kind of language that invited concern, because I had grown tired of managing other people's concern about a situation I was managing myself, or believed I was. Thomas had never noticed the place cards. I had mentioned them once, early on, and he had looked genuinely puzzled, as though the detail were too small to have registered, and then mildly defensive in the way of someone who doesn't want to believe something uncomfortable about a person they love, and then nothing, no follow-through, no conversation with Miriam, no acknowledgement in subsequent gatherings that this was a pattern rather than an oversight. This was, I came to understand, representative of how Thomas handled the specific, small-scale demonstrations of his mother's feelings about me. He noticed the larger incidents when I named them clearly enough. He responded to them with the mild pushback I have already described. He did not follow through in any way that produced actual change, and he did not notice the smaller incidents at all, which was its own kind of information because the smaller incidents were precisely the ones that, accumulated, constituted the substance of my daily experience of his mother. The pattern during the pregnancy had a different quality from the pattern of the preceding years, more concentrated, more urgent in its undertone, as though the baby's arrival had imposed a deadline on something Miriam had been working toward without explicitly naming her goal. She had inserted herself into the pregnancy with an immediacy that I had initially misread as enthusiasm before I recognized it as something more strategic. She had opinions, as I have mentioned, about everything. But more than opinions, she had a way of making those opinions feel like the standard from which any deviation was a failure of good judgment rather than simply a different choice. The hospital I had chosen was fine, she said, though she had heard the one across town had a rather excellent neonatal unit, not that I should worry about that, of course. The name we had tentatively settled on was lovely, she said, though it was interesting how names fell in and out of fashion, wasn't it? And there was something to be said for names with a little more history to them. Each of these was small. Each was deniable. Each was, alone, the kind of thing that a person could absorb without particular damage. Assembled across 8 months of pregnancy, they constituted something I had found, by the third trimester, genuinely exhausting to navigate, the specific exhaustion of someone who is managing a sustained, low-level threat while also growing a human being, which turns out to be a significant amount of simultaneous work. Thomas had observed most of this. He had been present for more of Miriam's commentary during the pregnancy than he had been for the preceding year's worth of smaller incidents, simply because the pregnancy had brought us into more frequent contact with her, and because I had, during the pregnancy, become less willing to smooth over incidents that I might previously have absorbed in silence. That he had, on 2 occasions during the pregnancy, done something more than mild pushback. I want to be fair and accurate about this, because the full picture requires accounting for the moments that complicated my understanding of him as well as the moments that clarified it. The first occasion was a dinner, approximately 5 months into the pregnancy, when Miriam had made a comment about my work. I had continued working through most of the pregnancy, which Miriam found notable in a way she expressed as admiration and which registered as criticism, that had been pointed enough. That Thomas had said, directly and with some heat, "Mom, that's enough." 2 words beyond his usual gentle intervention, and delivered with an edge I hadn't heard him use with her before. Miriam had retreated immediately, with the specific, practiced retreat of someone who understands exactly how much pressure a structure can take and withdraws before the pressure becomes consequential. She had said of course, she was sorry, she was just saying, and the dinner had continued, and nothing further had been established beyond the fact that Thomas had, on this one occasion, been willing to use his voice with an authority that usually remained theoretical. That I had held on to this moment. I had returned to it, in the weeks that followed, during occasions when I needed to believe that Thomas was, at some fundamental level, on my side rather than simply managing competing loyalties without fully committing to either. The second occasion was more private and more significant. We had been in bed, about a week after the dinner, and I had been describing a conversation with Miriam that had upset me, not the dinner incident, a separate conversation about the birth plan, and Thomas had put down what he was reading and turned toward me and said, with a seriousness that was different from his usual handling of these conversations, "I hear you. I think she goes too far. I'm going to talk to her." He had looked at me when he said it with the specific, direct quality of someone making a genuine commitment rather than managing an uncomfortable moment. That I had believed him because I wanted to, which I understood even at the time was not the same as having adequate evidence to believe him, but which felt sufficient in the moment of his saying it because he was my husband and the father of the child I was carrying and the person I had built my life around, and choosing to believe the sincere version of what he was offering required less reconstruction than the alternative. He had not talked to her. Or if he had, the conversation had produced no observable result, which amounted to the same thing in practice even if it didn't in intention. The specific moment that I think of now is the actual turning point, not the Sunday lunch smile, which was the culmination, but the earlier moment that established the full shape of what the smile would eventually confirm. Happened approximately 3 weeks before the Sunday lunch, on a Thursday evening when Thomas and I were having dinner at home. That we had been talking about the birth plan, which had become, by that point, a recurring subject because Miriam's involvement in discussions of it had been persistent enough that managing her involvement had become a practical logistical question rather than simply a boundary issue. That I had said something that I had been working up to saying for several days, something direct and specific about what I needed from Thomas, not in general terms but in concrete, practical terms. I needed him to tell his mother that the delivery room decisions were mine. That her opinion on who was present and when and under what circumstances was not, in fact, being solicited. That the conversations she continued to initiate with him about this topic were ones he needed to redirect rather than engage with. Thomas had been quiet for a moment after I said this. Then he had said something that I had been turning over in the weeks since, something I had initially filed as a misstatement born of tiredness and had been slowly reclassifying, against my own preferences, as something more deliberate. That he had said, "She's going to be the child's grandmother. I have to manage that relationship for the next 30 years. I need to choose my battles." I had looked at him across the dinner table. "And this isn't one of the battles worth choosing," I said. He had not answered immediately. And his not answering immediately had been, I understood sitting at that table, its own kind of answer, the answer of someone who had, somewhere in the calculation he was running about the next 30 years, placed the integrity of my position within his family in a column labeled manageable rather than essential. That I had not said more. I had finished my dinner. I had gone through the rest of the evening with the specific, contained quality of someone who is processing something significant and has decided not to process it out loud until they understand it better. I understood it better 3 weeks later, at the Sunday lunch, when I watched Thomas smile. What I had been living with, I understood then, was not a husband who was imperfect at standing up for me. I had been telling myself this story for 4 years and it had served its function, which was to allow me to remain inside the marriage without requiring me to look at what the imperfection actually indicated. What I had been living with was a husband whose primary loyalty, when all the smaller daily choices and the mild pushbacks and the well-intentioned commitments that didn't produce follow-through were assembled into a complete picture, was not to me. And I was 37 weeks pregnant, and his mother had just implied, in a room full of his family, that my child was probably not his, and he had smiled. That I sat on the edge of our bed that Sunday afternoon, in the late light, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I had been not quite feeling for 4 years, which was the specific, particular loneliness of a woman who has been inside a marriage and also, in some essential way, outside of it, present in the structure without being fully included in the loyalty that should have been the structure's foundation, that I was not ready to blow the marriage apart. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is an expectation in stories like this that the moment of clear seeing produces an immediate, dramatic response, and that is not what happened. What happened was quieter and more specific than that I was ready, for the first time in 4 years, to require something rather than to ask for it, not to ask Thomas to be on my side. To require it. To attach to that requirement an actual consequence rather than the patient, hopeful waiting I had been practicing since the first Thanksgiving and the missing place card, the baby moved while I was sitting there, the specific, physical assertion of another person who existed and would continue to exist regardless of what the adults around her worked out, and I put my hand on my stomach and I thought, whatever I decide about this marriage, she is going to watch how I make this decision. That thought clarified everything that I did not confront Thomas that night. And I want to explain why, because I think the delay matters as much as anything that came after it. I had learned, across 4 years of watching Miriam operate, that the people who did the most lasting damage were rarely the ones who acted in the heat of a feeling but the ones who waited until the feeling had cooled into something with a shape, something that could be delivered with precision rather than spent in the diffuse, forgivable chaos of an argument. That I wanted my confrontation with Thomas to have a shape. So I waited 2 days. I went to my scheduled appointment on the Monday, sat through the specific indignities of the late-term exam with the same contained composure I had been practicing for 4 years, heard the doctor tell me that everything looked exactly as it should, and drove home with that reassurance sitting alongside everything else I was carrying. I made dinner on the Tuesday. I let Thomas talk about his work day and client situation that was apparently consuming considerable energy at his office, and I listened with what I hoped read as ordinary attentiveness rather than the particular attentiveness of someone cataloging a person before she dismantles something with him. On Wednesday evening, after the dishes were done and the kitchen was quiet and there was no reasonable escape route available to either of us, I asked him to sit down. I want to talk about Sunday. I said that he had the good grace, at least, not to pretend he didn't know what I meant. I know Mom's comment was out of line, he said. I should have said something. I'll call her. That's not what I want to talk about, I said. I want to talk about your face. He looked at me with the particular confusion of someone who has prepared for one conversation and is being handed a different one. You smiled, I said. Your mother implied, in front of your entire family, that the child I am carrying might not be yours. And you smiled. Not a grimace. Not an uncomfortable smile. An easy smile, Thomas. The smile of a man who was, in that moment, comfortable. He started to say something about being caught off guard, about not fully processing what she'd said in real time, and I let him get about a sentence and a half into it before I stopped him, because I had promised myself I would not let this conversation dissolve into the explanations that had absorbed every previous incident. I don't think you misheard her, I said. I think some part of you has always found it easier to let her say things than to lose whatever it costs you to stop her. I think you have spent 4 years choosing the version of loyalty that doesn't require you to disappoint her, and calling it patience. And I need you to understand that I am done accepting that as the shape of this marriage. I told him about the place cards. I don't think he had ever registered, across the accumulated years, that I remembered every single one, that I could have told him the seating chart of every holiday going back to that first Thanksgiving. I watched something in his face shift as I laid it out in sequence rather than in the isolated incidents he had always been permitted to consider separately. I watched him do, for the first time in 4 years, the arithmetic of the pattern rather than the individual excuses. I need you to talk to her, I said. Not the version of talking to her where you say something gentle and she apologizes and nothing changes. I need an actual conversation, with an actual consequence attached to what happens if it continues. And I need it before this baby is born, because I am not raising a daughter inside a house where the person meant to protect her mother finds his mother's cruelty something he can smile through. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had a rawness in it I hadn't heard before. I don't know how to fight her, he said. I've never known how. She raised me alone after Dad died. I learned a long time ago that the way you survive her is by not giving her a reason to turn the temperature up. I thought I was protecting everyone by keeping things smooth. You were protecting her, I said. Not us. I don't know that he agreed with me that night. But something in him had been dislodged, and I could see it, and I decided that was enough of a beginning to justify the second half of what I had planned. That I called Miriam myself the next morning. That I did not do this the way Thomas would have done it, gently, with room left for her to maneuver. I asked her to meet me for coffee, alone, and when she arrived, surprised, I think, by the invitation, since I had never in 4 years initiated a one-on-one meeting with her, I told her plainly that I knew exactly what she had implied on Sunday, that I understood it had been constructed carefully enough to be deniable, and that I was not interested in the deniability. I'm not going to ask you to like me, I told her. I gave up on that a long time ago. But you will not speak about my child's parentage again, in any room, to any person, in any register. And if you do, you will not be in the child's life. Not occasionally. Not on holidays. Not at all. That is not a threat. That is simply what will happen. Miriam, who had spent 4 years being the only person in every room who controlled its temperature, did not have a ready response for a woman who had stopped playing the game by her rules. She said something about how she'd only meant it as a joke, about modern couples and modern arrangements, and I let the excuse sit in the air between us without picking it up, because I no longer needed to argue with her reasoning. I only needed her to understand the boundary. That it was on my way out of that coffee shop, checking my phone, that I found the message from Caroline, my sister-in-law, who had been sitting beside Miriam on Sunday when the comment was made, and who had apparently spent the day since turning something over in her own conscience. Caroline told me something I hadn't known, that this wasn't the first time. That 2 years earlier, before I had ever gotten pregnant, Miriam had said something almost identical about a cousin's baby, had implied, with the same practiced deniability, that the child wasn't who everyone assumed, and that it had caused a rift in that branch of the family that had never fully healed, a rift everyone had quietly agreed never to discuss in front of me. That it wasn't a spontaneous cruelty. It was a method Miriam had used before, successfully enough that she felt safe using it again. That I sat in my car outside the coffee shop with that message on my screen, and I understood that what I had experienced as a single, isolated wound was in fact a second instance of a signature, and that everyone in the family who had watched it happen once and said nothing had made the second time possible. Thomas found out about the cousin's baby the same way I did, except he found out from me, sitting across the kitchen table 3 days after my coffee with Miriam, and I watched something in him go still in a way I hadn't seen before, not the defensive stillness of a man protecting his mother, but the stillness of someone recalculating a person he thought he understood. Why didn't anyone tell me, he said, and it wasn't really a question, because he already knew the answer. Nobody had told him because telling him had never, in 37 years, produced a consequence worth the discomfort of telling him. The family had learned the same lesson I had learned, and had made the same accommodation, and Thomas's easy nature, the very thing that made him gentle and funny and good to come home to, had also made him, without his ever choosing it directly, the reason his mother's behavior had never once cost her anything. That he drove to Miriam's house alone that evening. I don't know everything that was said, because I wasn't there, and I didn't ask him to perform the conversation for my benefit afterward. I had learned, finally, the difference between a husband reporting back for reassurance and a husband handling something because it was his to handle. What I do know is that he came home 3 hours later, quieter than I had seen him in years, and told me only this, that he had told his mother the comment about the cousin, the comment about our baby, and whatever pattern existed between them, were finished. That if it happened again, in any form, she would not be told when her grandchild was born, would not be given an address, would not be allowed the kind of access she had always assumed was hers by right rather than earned through decency. That he told me he had cried in the car afterward, which he had not done, as far as I knew, since his father's funeral. I did not need him to perform grief for me. I needed him to mean the boundary, and in the weeks that followed, he did. He redirected Miriam's calls when they veered toward commentary, ended conversations plainly when she tested the new terms, and did it without the apologetic softness that had characterized every previous intervention. It was not perfect. He is, I think, always going to carry some instinct towards smoothing things over with her, some residue of the boy who learned that peace with his mother was the price of feeling safe. But the instinct stopped being the whole of him, and that was the thing I had actually been asking for. Miriam tested the boundary exactly once, at a family dinner 6 weeks after the baby was born, with a comment aimed at Caroline about how remarkably the baby resembled Thomas, delivered with a faint, knowing emphasis that made clear she understood precisely what she was doing and precisely how close to the line she was walking. Thomas stood up from the table, lifted our daughter from her bassinet, and said, calmly, that we would be leaving. We did not return to Miriam's house for 5 months. When we did, it was on our terms, at a length of our choosing, and Miriam, who had spent 5 months discovering exactly how much her son's forgiveness could no longer be assumed, was, for the first time in the history of my relationship with her, careful that I will not tell you the wound closed entirely. It didn't. There is a particular grief in learning, at 37 weeks pregnant, that the person you married had to be taught, through consequence rather than request, to choose you, and no later tenderness fully erases the fact that the teaching was necessary at all. But I have come to believe that a marriage isn't measured only by what a person does by instinct. It is measured, too, by what they're capable of doing when someone finally, clearly, requires it of them, and by whether they do it and keep doing it once the requiring is over. Our daughter was born 9 days after my due date, in the hospital I had chosen, in the room I had chosen, with the people I had chosen present and no one else. Thomas held her before I did, actually, because the delivery had gone sideways for a few minutes in a way that required my full attention elsewhere, and when I finally held her myself, she had that particular new, unformed face that gives away nothing about who a baby resembles, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt earned rather than given, it was never actually about whose face she has. It was about who was going to stand in the room and protect the truth, regardless of what anyone else in that room found it convenient to imply. She has Thomas's chin now, as it turns out. She has my mother's eyes. Miriam has never mentioned it again.